Now, let's keep some context in mind. In these verses and chapters that we just read, Moses is speaking to the second generation, the children who grew up in the wilderness and who will be entering the promised land. Therefore, they are in need of two things. They need, one, to preserve the past history between God and their ancestors, and two, they in fact need new information for how to practice and implement the covenant of their ancestors in this new land. They are in fact the transitional generation between the past and the future. They're absolutely critical. So to them is given the full entirety of the Mosaic covenant, the Ten Commandments, the book of Deuteronomy, and Zakhor. And this enables the second generation to connect with their ancestors' past, as was recorded in Exodus, but also to give them new information in order to move forward into a future beyond what their ancestors experienced. Zakhor then becomes that connector of the past with the present in order to establish the future for Israel. Zakhor is the ability to upload into the minds and hearts and souls of future generations the experiences of their forefathers, the supernatural past between their relationship with God and just everything that makes up the very essence of their Jewish identity. And so, remember, do not forget, write it upon your heart and keep these words. All these are commanded by God to bring about connection and continuity, where in fact the natural human tendency is to forget, to stop, and to even just dismiss, especially when it comes to, just all the differences between generations. Zakhor enables the younger generation to remember their ancestors' past. And in fact, it enables the older generation to move forward into the newness of the future without fear of compromise or forgetfulness. But the way to Zakhor, the way to right remembering for the Israelites, it went far beyond the mere intellect that, our Western thinking would have us assume. It in fact centered and revolved around action. The Jewish past is not merely remembered, but it's continuously reenacted. Notice the action steps that God gives after the Shema. How shall Israel then keep these words upon their hearts? And how are they to love God with all their hearts, souls, and might? Well, they shall teach them diligently to their children. They shall talk of them when they sit, when they walk, when they lie down, when they rise. They shall bind them as a sign. They shall keep them as frontlets between their eyes. And lastly, they shall write them on the doorposts of their houses and their gates. Sounds pretty proactive to me. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. Isn't this figurative language, not meant to be interpreted literally? Well, that's a rabbit trail that I will address at the end of this video, so stay tuned. But either way, in Deuteronomy, action is the way to right Zakhor, to right remembering. The right ritual or the right action stimulates the right memory. And of course, right remembering stirs up the right love. See, in Judaism, prayers are actually made up of two balancing forces, or even opposites, keva and kavanah. Keva is the structure to follow. When you open a Jewish prayer book or a siddur, you'll see a bunch of keva. Keva tells you how to pray, when to pray, what to pray. But when you start praying through the keva, the goal, in fact, is to enter into kavanah, the inner worship of the heart, the outpouring of the soul, or in other words, the right love. But without keva, it's hard, if not outright impossible, to reach kavanah. And likewise, without Zakhor, it's hard, if not impossible, to have chesed, the right love for God or for people. But right love is obedience before the Lord. This is the obedience that God, in fact, seeks. External ritual is nothing if it does not engage the internal heart. for God looks on the heart. But at the same time, I also believe the internal is not fully complete or even motivated without external expression. And as Messianic believers in Yeshua, I think we get that more than anyone. We know how fulfilling it is to observe the Jewish feasts like Passover, Sukkot, or Yom Kippur. And we know how much it stirs up the right spirit within us when we practice it, when we enter into that Zakhor. And indeed, we participate in them because they are the ancient expressions that God has established to best engage our hearts and stimulate them toward right knowing and right loving, toward faith and toward good works, toward spirit and truth. Even C.S. Lewis once said, "The joy is not complete until it is expressed." Of course, our joy is still there, even if it is not expressed, and Yeshua said that no one can, in fact, take away our joy from us. But I believe that our joy is best fulfilled when it remembers rightly, when it remembers its ancient roots, when it remembers through action. And in so remembering, we come to love the Ancient of Days with all our hearts, all our soul, and all our might. There is a right way that leads to life. Jesus is the way, and he himself observed Zakhor and practiced all these things, leaving us an example to follow in his footsteps. He said, "Do this, keva, in remembrance of me," kavanah. So let's examine ourselves and our motives, maybe for why we do what we do. Is it because we have to? Have we grown too used to the familiar? Where have we grown forgetful, perhaps? Has our heart lost its worshipful touch with the external expressions of worship? And what do you need God to personally remind you of again today? Like Israel, we forget too much too often. Sometimes we even lapse into entire seasons of forgetfulness. But I love the encouragement that Deuteronomy 4:31 brings. This time, instead of telling the people once again not to forget, it actually says the Lord will not forget, and he will cause his people to return. Now, for all the nerds still watching, back to the question, is Deuteronomy 6 figurative or literal? Well, as you can imagine, the Jewish commentaries on these verses contrast very starkly from the Christian commentaries when it comes to interpretation of Deuteronomy 6. Jewish commentators all emphatically say that it is clearly tefillin, literal tefillin, while Christian commentators say that such language is likely symbolic or figurative, as expressing a posture of the heart. What is usually argued as either or, Deuteronomy gives as a both and response. So one of the ways Deuteronomy repeats Zakhor to Israel is by the figurative way, writing it upon your heart. But it also does it as a heavy, heavy emphasis on literal action to be practiced. So it can be both. Jewish rabbis and commentators are right to point to putting on literal tefillin because that can help engage the more figurative posture of the hearts. Besides that, Deuteronomy does often give more constant attention and mention to practice over posture. But what it does not do is put the two at odds with each other. Like the balancing forces of keva and kavanah, the practice exists for the sake of a certain posture. And that's the main point. Okay, so if you enjoyed these videos, consider subscribing and don't forget to remember,